Hello students, the topic of today's lesson is teaching pronunciation, the issues. The objectives of today's lesson are to identify the problems of pronunciation faced by students, to critically examine the issues related to the teaching of pronunciation, to develop a conceptual understanding about the theoretical framework for teaching pronunciation, to compare the research-based approach and the traditional approach to pronunciation instruction, to get familiarized with a few strategies for teaching pronunciation. Pronunciation problems faced by non-native learners. So, in order to understand how we want to improve the pronunciation of non-native learners, we need to understand what are the problems that they face. So, if we have an idea of what are the problems, we can think about ways of helping them solve these problems by developing some strategies. We are now familiar with the speech sounds and the classification of sounds based on certain discernible parameters. The sounds that we have discussed in preceding lessons are said to be of standard English accent, which is also known as received pronunciation. Sometimes we abbreviate it as RP. Yes. There is another standard accent known as the General American, abbreviated as GA. So, both these two varieties are predominantly found in our workbooks. Researchers working on the teaching of RP to non-native learners have identified few areas where learners are likely to go wrong in articulation. So, some of these are: they fail to differentiate between the sound O and O. For example, in the word cot versus the word caught. There was a cot in my room. I caught the ball. There was a cot in my room. I caught the ball. So, it is difficult to differentiate between these two sounds for a non-native speaker of English. So, when you were trying to listen to me, sometimes we are not very sure if which word did we hear, which sound did we hear. Was it O as in caught or O as in caught? Another example, the difficulty in differentiating between the sound y and e. For example, the word east, representing the directions, is sometimes pronounced as yeast. So, this type of problems exist even among native speakers of English, and therefore, it is considerably acceptable on a global level. Another type of problem is caused by lack of awareness. So, students do not know certain features or certain tips of pronunciation, because of which they end up incorrectly articulating a particular sound or a word. For example, if you take languages like Hindi and Malayalam, this sounds p, t, k. There is an aspirated form and there is an unaspirated form. So, when we learn these languages, we learn them as p, p, t, t, k, k. But in English, however, students sometimes are not aware that p, t, k, when they come in the initial position of a word, for example, pot, top, kite. When p, t, k come in the initial position of a word, they are to be aspirated. So, lack of awareness sometimes causes such kind of difficulties. but by raising awareness of students of certain tips and certain rules of pronunciation, we can help students to improve their pronunciation. Some problems, however, are common to all Indian states. For example, the same one, aspirated sound pa-ta-ka, whether it is pa-ta-ka or pa-ta-ka. How do we articulate that? Difficulty in distinguishing between the sound w in voice and w in water. They look very similar. So, this difficulty in distinguishing between these two sounds, difficulty to distinguish between s and sh. Is it ship or sip? I was sipping coffee or he was on the ship. Yes, so when you are giving the context, you are able to make the difference. But if you normally say sa or sh, it is difficult for some speakers, non-native speakers particularly. Now, difficulty with final cluster. By final cluster, we mean the consonants that are following the final vowel in a word. For example, the word wasp, where the final cluster is s, p. Quite simple. Take the word against, n, s, t. Some non-native speakers end up saying against by inserting another vowel in the final consonant. Take the example 12th. The final cluster here has l, f, th. So far we have looked at the problems with consonants. If we look at the problem with vowel, the long vowel and the short vowel, is it pull or pool, oo or oo? Diphthongs. Diphthongs are sounds which are a combination of two vowel sounds. Suprasegmental features, that is the aspect of stress, for example, are also some of the common problems faced by the non-native speakers of English. In addition to these, there are some state-specific problems. We can identify the difficulties if we have to look at the example like the Bengali language speakers. Some of them might find it difficult to differentiate between v and b. Is it vidya or bidya? That difficulty. Some Tamil speakers might add a u sound at the end of words. Or if you have to take the example of Telugu speakers, bukku, pennu. So, they might add an extra sound which doesn't normally exist in the word. In case of Hindi language, some speakers might use r sound as a trill. Experts propose a few steps for teaching sounds. These are identifying students' problem areas, finding a meaningful context for problem sounds, like for example, I was talking about sip and ship, developing communicatively relevant tasks that incorporate the sound, developing at least 3 or 4 exercises that are able to give enough practice, because it is through practice that they come to understand how a sound should be correctly articulated. Teaching pronunciation, the problems. Now, how important is pronunciation instruction and how much time should be allotted in the already crowded curriculum are the questions that will land up in controversies. Some teachers might argue that pronunciation is not important at all, but for some others, they find they want to teach pronunciation but they say we don't know how to teach pronunciation even if they want to. Almost always the teacher in India aims at teaching the RP, received pronunciation. In order to achieve the aim, they go for extensive drilling of sounds and words. We can find a proliferation of materials in print as well as audio and video material that give lessons on discrete sounds. By discrete sounds, I mean individual sounds are being given the focus instead of placing them in a context, placing them in more than the level of a word in a sentence. So, if you are able to contrast that. We were talking about a number of teachers opting to aim at reaching received pronunciation for their learners. However, we will avoid practicing discrete sounds of RP for a number of reasons. In the Indian context, neither the teacher nor the students' vocal organs are habituated to its use. There are several native speakers who produce sounds that deviate from the RP. So, native speakers themselves at times might deviate from the exact correct pronunciation. There are several versions of accepted English pronunciation. Therefore, it is unnecessary for the English teachers to get themselves preoccupied with teaching of RP. Learning the pronunciation of English doesn't mean learning how to pronounce the individual vowels and consonant sounds. The scope of pronunciation is much broader than an inventory of sounds and the description of sounds. It embraces the elements of rhythm and intonation which function in the communication process. Native speakers acquire the nuances of sounds in the language by listening to connected speech and not discrete sounds and words. The features of any given phoneme changes based on its neighboring sounds and where it occurs in the connected speech. In this context, it is worth quoting Pinker. The sequence of sounds we think we hear within a word are an illusion. If you were to cut up a tape of someone saying cat, you would not get exact pieces of sound like k, a and t. The units called phonemes that correspond roughly to the letters of the alphabet. And if you splice the pieces together in the reverse order, they would be unintelligible, not tack. Yes, if you were to take the word cat and splice it up, k, a, t, and if you would put them up together, you would end up with a sound which actually might be unintelligible. As we shall see, information about each component of a word is smeared over the entire word. Pinker says that even speech is an illusion. In the speech sound wave, one word runs into the next seamlessly. There are no little silences between spoken words the way there are white spaces between written words. So, he is pointing out at the absence of the silences, that it doesn't correspond to someone pausing after each word. When in connected speech, you would not give such spaces as you would see in a written form. So, we simply hallucinate word boundaries when we reach the edge of a stretch of sound that matches some entry in our mental dictionary. It is impossible to tell where one word ends and the next begins. Consider, for example, oronyms. These are an interesting example to show what Pinker is talking about. Oronyms are strings of sounds that can be carved into words in two different ways. Let me give you an example. Consider the good can decay many ways versus the good candy came anyways. So where you identify the word boundary could be completely different. The good can decay many ways versus the good candy came anyways. Let's take another example. The stuffy nose can lead to problems versus the stuff he knows can lead to problems. Another example, some others I have seen versus some mothers I have seen. Oronyms are often used in songs and nursery rhymes. For example, ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. Yes, so the word boundary between I scream, if you were to make it ice cream, is it I screaming or is it ice cream, something which you eat? The point we are trying to make is, if we want to introduce English to the vast Indian population from the earliest levels of learning and teaching, the idea of teaching through RP as a model should be dropped as an unrealistic goal sooner than later. And general Indian English should be made the goal. With the globalization of English language, there are several versions of accepted English pronunciation in the world. In the near future, we might have more versions too. Hence, rendering our preoccupation with RP is unnecessary. We should also bear in mind that by giving learners practice in discrete sounds and words is not going to help them improve their pronunciation in or spoken English for that matter. It is in this backdrop that we have to discuss the various strategies and techniques for helping learners to acquire the subtle features of spoken English. Theoretical framework for teaching pronunciation. The discussion in the preceding sessions calls for conceptualizing a theoretical paradigm for teaching pronunciation. The comparison of a research-based approach and traditional approach for pronunciation, as discussed in Sarsella and Oxford 1994, will be helpful for us to move forward in this direction. They have identified 7 major changes that would be necessary to move away from the traditional models of teaching pronunciation. They are: change number 1, from a language learning perspective of outside in to one of inside out. That is, a new concept where language acquisition views learner as the active prime mover in the learning process. Change number 2, following from the altered conceptualization of learning process, a movement from a focus on group to an increasing focus on the individual learner differences, individual learning styles and strategies. Change number 3, from a focus on language as simply a formal system to a focus on language as both formal and functional system, and one that exists to satisfy the communicative needs of its users. Change number 4, from linguistic preoccupation with sentence level grammar to a widening interest in semantics, pragmatics, discourse and speech act theory. Change number 5, from an instructional focus on linguistic form and correct usage to one on function and communicatively appropriate use. Change number 6, from an orientation of linguistic competence to one of communicative competence. Change number 7, from a global competence concept to a set of detailed competency specifications, and the introduction of a specifically useful model that brings together a number of viewpoints in one linguistically oriented and pedagogically useful framework that takes care of A. grammatical competence, B. sociolinguistic competence, C. discourse competence, and D. strategic competence. These developments have led to a wide variety of changes in virtually all aspects of ESL and EFL teaching, including the area of pronunciation. For example, we can no longer consider pronunciation to be taught as a set of rules that someone has to memorize and use. Instead, we can look at it as a part of the overall system of communication. So, if communication is an overall system, you are trying to look at pronunciation as a part of it, not as something which you have to learn separately as rules that you have to keep in your mind when you are using language. It can be seen that the overall theoretical framework proposed by Sarsella and Oxford is quite compatible with the theoretical assumptions of discourse-oriented pedagogy. But some of the specifications have to be spelt out, have to be made more clear. Consider, for example, the shift from a learning perspective of outside in to one of inside out. This is implied in conceptualizing of language as an innate system. It also implies non-conscious process of language acquisition. If you look at change number 2, which was addressing individual learner differences and individual learning styles and strategies, this is taken care of by developing learning activities that facilitate multiple intelligences. Now, the crux of the shift implied in changes number 3 to 7, the emphasis there was communicative competence. Changes 4 and 7 also suggest a move from a mere linguistic formal competence to sociolinguistic, discourse and strategic competence. Discourse-oriented pedagogy addresses these areas by defining academic standards in terms of linguistic and discourse-related features of various discourses that are targeted at each level of learning. The modular mode of classroom transaction is meant to achieve standards. Discourse level of treatment of language in terms of both at the input and output levels takes care of the harmonious blending of formal and functional aspects of language. It also covers the areas of pragmatics, semantics and speech acts. Now, teaching pronunciation should be done in a meaningful and motivating way. As good pronunciation is closely linked with clear oral communication, it is advisable to place students in a meaningful and contextual situation rather than present them with a series of sentences or a series of isolated sentences rather than keeping them in a context or a connected text. In selecting or designing materials, special attention should be paid to those which contain not only sufficient concentration of the sound to be practiced, but short dialogues, pair words. Remember, I was talking about the contrast between words. Is it pull or pool, sip or ship, or other contextual practices as well. Therefore, students become active participants in their pair or group work, applying the phonetic rules they have learned to the actual practice. Comparison of research-based and traditional approach to pronunciation. So, how have we been teaching pronunciation and what does research tell us on teaching pronunciation? So the focus of this module will be a comparison. The theoretical framework presented in the preceding session points to the need for changing our perspective on teaching pronunciation. We will have to go for a research-based approach to teaching pronunciation, incorporating the insights available from theoretical linguistics and cognitive psychology. More specifically, we will need to evolve classroom processes that are in conformity with the parameters of the constructivist paradigm. As a prerequisite to this, we will critically examine the highlights of the research-based approach to pronunciation instruction, comparing them with the traditional approach. Such a comparison is available from Sarsella and Oxford. Let us look at Table 1. In research-based approach, the goal is to gain sufficient pronunciation skills so that the quality of pronunciation will not inhibit communication. In the traditional approach, however, the goal of instruction is to acquire native-like pronunciation. In research-based approach, instead of putting the emphasis on sounds, teachers who follow research-based approach concentrate on stress and intonation. In the traditional approach, however, the primary emphasis is on teaching sounds. In research-based approach, the emphasis of instruction is on teaching pronunciation communicatively. In the traditional approach, sound segments are taught non-communicatively through drills of isolated words. In research-based approach, teachers provide students with phonetic descriptions only when they are helpful to students in tutorials. In the traditional approach, phonetic descriptions make a primary component. In research-based approach, the student's motivation is seen as central to successful language instruction. The student plays a primary role in improving pronunciation. Self-monitoring skills and awareness strategies are taught. In the traditional approach, students do not take responsibility for improving their own pronunciation. In research-based approach, affect is critical in pronunciation instruction. Students learn specific relaxation activities to lower anxieties and resistance to improving pronunciation. In the traditional approach, affect is not viewed as important in instructional activities. In the sessions that follow, we will discuss how to work out classroom processes that will reflect the pedagogical implications of each of these aspects. For this, we will meet in the next session. Thank you, students.